Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moffin coming at you with another AP U.S. government video. This time we're taking a look at topic 1.6, Principles of American Government. And in this video, this set of videos, we're going to be taking a look at two of the very important principles of American government, at least two of them. That's going to be separation of powers and checks and balances. And even though we tend to use those phrases in conjunction with one another, they are not the same thing, although that is a common mistake students do make. So let's go ahead and get into this by taking a look at one of these principles, and that is separation of powers. Now, for those of you that are not quite familiar with this term, separation of powers is talking about the idea of taking the power of government. The idea of being able to use that power of government in its totality, and instead of putting all of that power, vesting all of that power in a singular person, like an absolute ruling king or a dictator, or a singular, legislative body, kind of like the Congress during the Articles of Confederation, or a set of judges, if you will. It's taking all of that power of government in totality and divvying up into different branches, each with a different set of responsibilities. In our system, as you can see here in this graphic, we divvied up into three branches. One of those branches being the legislative branch, and that branch makes the laws. In our federal system, that's most known by the term Congress, the U.S. Congress. We also have the executive branch, who is responsible for carrying out or enforcing the laws that are made by the legislative branch. In our federal system, that is headed ultimately by the President of the United States, but also includes everybody else known collectively as the bureaucracy. And then we also have the power of the judicial branch, whose job it is to interpret the laws. And that's probably the hardest for people to kind of understand what that means, is that the court's basic overall job, at least in this terms of sense of separation of powers, is to decide, whether or not, it's basically to decide, what does the Constitution mean? What do the words mean? Any important document, I don't care if you're talking about the Constitution, if you're taking a look at a contract, heck, even, religious texts like the Bible, they're open to wide interpretation. And so these folks are responsible ultimately for basically telling us what the Constitution means. So with that, in mind, that also includes basically being able to decide, which we kind of get a little bit later in this idea of judicial review, the idea of, when Congress makes a law or the president, takes an action, are those steps, are those, actions taken by Congress and or the president, are they in line with what the Constitution says is allowable? So in our Constitution, we separate these powers out, and we do that on purpose. We do that for a reason, and we'll kind of get more into that in just a moment. But understand that each of these different branches of government have their own responsibility. Now, what that then means, though, is that when we do talk about, one of the key words in this course, policy, meaning the actions of government to solve the problems that society faces, all three branches in their own way play a role in policy creating. Obviously, when you make a law, you're creating policy. In other words, this is what, has to be done. Okay, in other words, this is what is mandated. Like it might be, protections for the handicapped under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The president plays a role in policy in terms of, let's say you have a law like the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, basically deciding, well, who does that include? What do we mean by disabled? How do we, enforce this? What kind of penalties maybe have to be decided upon for those that do not comply with the law? And then ultimately, with the judiciary branch, being able to deal with situations where, like, let's say somebody has been charged with violating the law, let's say the Americans with Disabilities Act, the courts then have to decide whether or not that person has violated that law. And then also, ultimately, if challenged, to decide whether or not that law in and of itself is even in line with the legitimate power of government via the Constitution. So all three branches play a critical role in the policy process. Now, as I said a moment ago, having separation of powers as a core principle in our government is not just something that we've arbitrarily done. It's not by accident. It was done with reason. It was done with logic. And a lot of that is embodied in one of the Federalist Papers, and that is Federalist number 51. And this is one of the ones that you do need to know for this AP test, Federalist 51. And basically in this, you see Madison describing why we need to have not just separation of powers, but also checks and balances, which we'll get to in a later video, but just suffice to say checks and balances, the idea of vesting each branch with not just its own authority in government, but the ability to limit, meaning check, the power of other branches to make sure that no one branch becomes superior over the others, or becomes tyrannical in some way. And the reason why we have this system, why we have these principles put into the framework of the Constitution, is because of the frailties of humans. Madison is very clear. He says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So, understand that even though government must come from the people, like John Locke says, and like the Declaration of Independence asserts, humans are flawed by definition. They are imperfect. Human beings fall short of being honorable 100% of the time and doing the right thing 100% of the time. Human beings are, in many cases, selfish and greedy and, desirous of power and things like that. So because of understanding that reality, we can't just have a system where we just create government and trust the government's just going to do the right thing. You can't just create a president and assume the president will act appropriately. You have to have mechanisms for that. You can't let a single person as president have all the power, because what if that person is corrupt? That's a problem. So that is significant. Also, you might think, well, we have a framework in place, that holds people in government accountable. We elect people to Congress. We indirectly via the Electoral College elect the President of the United States. And that's all true. And yes, those do play a natural check on the abuse of certain, branches of government, but it's not enough. It's just not enough. You could elect someone into power, in using the president is probably the easiest example because it's a singular person, but you could elect someone into power as president, and what are you going to do for the next 4 years? How are you going to hold that president accountable until the next election? What if, via the 22nd Amendment, presidents can only serve 2 terms, and this is a president's second term, and they don't have to worry about re-election anymore. So, you've got to have some other things in place to limit the power of individuals or groups in government, because they just have a natural tendency to be tyrannical. When you give people power, and the longer they hold power, they are more inclined to abuse that power, and at a minimum try to, gain more power. That's just a natural thing that humans do. So you got to have systems in place to, counteract for natural human shortcomings. Now, that being said, even though when we look at separation of powers as a principle and divvying up the responsibilities of governing into those 3 branches, with the understanding that each of those branches will be viewed as equals under the government, once again, we do have to kind of, be realistic in terms of that. Madison is going to be pretty clear in the way that he writes that there's an understanding that even amongst these 3 equal branches of government, Congress is going to be envisioned as the driving force of governments, a first amongst equals, if you will. I tend to use the phrase, driving the bus in terms of like power and setting the agenda for government and, kind of deciding what direction we're going to go and things like that. And the founders did not envision that being driven by the president. They didn't envision that. They envisioned Congress doing it because they kind of envisioned government going in the direction of lawmaking. So in other words, the idea is Congress will decide what the laws are, and then the other branches will kind of, respond to that. It doesn't really exactly work that way today, but that's what was envisioned. And, for the most part, for about the first 100 years of governing under the Constitution, that's pretty much how it worked. So anyhow, this is just wanted to in this video introduce the importance of separation of powers, especially, and of course making sure that we are familiar with the required Federalist Paper number 51. All right, so we'll end it there for this time, and we will see you next time. Bye bye.